Hello and welcome to another episode of the MeG podcast. Don't know where we are, episode something of series 4. I think it's episode 7 of series 4. So for this episode, we're going to step away from army lists for a change and look at the subject of terrain. So we're planning on discussing between us how terrain can be used in games, how it can affect armies and army choices, and also maybe a bit of a look at the terrain we see modelled on our games tables. To help us with this for this episode, we've invited Paul Stovell to join Richard, Matt, and myself. We invited Paul because he's one of those players who I think looks a bit deeper into these sort of things, certainly looks deeper than I do, is able to insert his brain into the cracks in the rules maybe and see how things, the synergy between troops and terrain. Basically just a sneaky git, really, I think is the bottom line of it. So welcome on board for this episode to Paul.
Yeah, I'll hold my hand up to
that. And of course, welcome, as usual, to Richard Jeffrey Cook and Matt Haywood, the usual contributors.
Good evening.
Additionally, as with the last couple of episodes, we've asked people on social media and on the forum if they've got any questions relating to terrain. So hopefully we will be getting around to answering questions that have been submitted. So thank you to everybody who's contributed on that and sent them in fact, quite a few. I think please listen to as we go along, because I think some of the questions will actually likely to be answered by our discussions as we go, but we'll also try and keep an eye open to make sure the other questions are answered, time allowing. Of course, if we miss anybody, apologies, and you can always put a question on the forum if it is, especially if it's rules related, and maybe we can come back. Somebody will answer that. In some of the contributions people sent in, some people did question some of the rules basis of the terrain, but I think just in the interest of sanity, we're going to try and steer away from anything that sounds like a new rule or speculation about new rules, because I think that can cause confusion, but inevitably we may make comments along the way. But if we do, please don't read too much into it. It is just part of a discussion. And the last thing before we get into stuff, I would just say, I think this discussion is almost inevitably going to be rather dominated by the competition pickup style game. There's the one-to-one, standalone game. But hopefully some of the stuff will apply to all other games. And I think we will try and get some comments in on terrain in relation to scenario and campaign games as well. But, I think because of the nature of the rules, the rules exist. The rules on terrain, especially the setup, a lot of those do exist just for these one-to-one pickup games. Okay, enough of that sort of introduction. I think just to kick things off, to start the conversation, I think maybe just ask everybody here, the team, to comment on how they approach terrain. What some people in the questions have called either terrain strategy or the terrain game, in respect of the armies they use or armies they've thought about using, how this influences their choices when designing their army, and also choices of terrain when they're putting the terrain down in the terrain laying phase. So things things around the PBS and scouting, territory types, or any comments about that, maybe just observations or hints and tips. I think that's when we come to Paul, especially for any devious hints and tips he might wish to pass on, although I'm sure he'll keep one or two up his own sleeve to spring on us at some stage. So once again, enough of me going on. So maybe if I ask Richard to kick off on this one, and other, Paul and Matt, please chip in. And especially Paul, because I've bigged him up as somebody to come in on this. So I think maybe if Richard, partly because he was obviously involved in writing the rules, is a good place to start. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. I wish to deny all knowledge of being involved in writing the rules. I may have edited them, but anyway, that's as much as I'm going to own up to.
I stand corrected.
So on terrain. So I think first of all, I think about terrain when it comes to the pre-battle system, because obviously that's the starting point where terrain goes down. And actually, it even starts with the opening dice roll of invader-defender selection, because in my opinion, the defender has a significant advantage in terrain selection compared to the invader. Whether you think that should be right or wrong, that's how the rules are. Basically, if there is a draw on choosing the territory type, the defender gets to choose the territory type. On the picking of the terrain pieces, although the defender picks first, they generally get the option of choosing what type of terrain they pick, and on the denser options that can have some advantages, and in some levels of density they also get to pick an extra terrain piece compared to the invader. So if terrain is important, you may wish to defend, and of course that links into the territory types that are available to the army that you're playing with. So what you don't really, I think, doesn't really help is having a territory types for an army that doesn't actually suit its actual troop types. I don't think that happens very often, but for example, you wouldn't want a loose foot army that only has a territory type of planes. I don't think one exists, by the way, but I'm just using that for example. So that's the sort of thing I would think about there.
Okay, so Richard, because a question pops into my head on that, because you sounds to me as if you sort of you will always tend to choose to defend if you get that choice off the initial dice roll. Is that true, and does that apply to Matt and Paul as well?
I think it's only if terrain is a key factor for the battle would I probably choose to defend. Actually, if I'm going against horse archer armies, my instinct is actually the opposite, to invade, but that's nothing to do with terrain. That's actually wanting to get halfway across the table, ideally, before those pesky horse archers can shoot at you.
Yeah.
But perhaps Matt and Paul have different ideas. I don't know.
I would agree with all you've said so far, Richard, actually, except possibly the last bit about changing the strategy against horse archers. I'm not convinced that the double move turn one is that much better than the opportunity cost you lose out on maybe having better terrain. Because if you double move, they probably will be shooting at you on turn 2. If you single move, they probably won't, and therefore you'll get most of your double move anyway, unless they want to stand very close to you at the start of turn 3.
Yeah, I think there's also the. Oh, sorry, Richard. After you.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I play it differently. Maybe I'm not playing it terribly well then, but I find I can't rely on terrain to go in the places I want it to. Maybe because my opponents are good at rolling sixes, I don't know. But I can rely on double moving.
Okay, Matt?
Pretty much in agreement to all of that. If I have an army that I think really prefers terrain, Aztecs would be one. Oddly, my Ottomans is another. Then I'm tending to look for a talented or a legendary professional general, because I want the PBS cards to try and control the amount of terrain that's going to hit, the higher dice to see if I can force to defend. Because oddly, Aztecs is one of those, I think, that is plains and mountains. I think it's almost diametrically opposite. So strategic intercept against Aztecs is actually quite nasty if you can't win the terrain card, which again is why you need the higher PBS cards in these circumstances to guarantee that you can win the if you've got a red and you play it, defender's choice. So yeah, but beyond that, pretty much in agreement.
I think I'm possibly a little more with Paul on this, especially if you're facing a horse archer army, defending to try and get terrain behind them as well. Put something like a forest behind horse archers, that really cramps their evading style.
It's great.
I've seen it used
works.
to. It's definitely, but if you defend, you're increasing the chances, aren't you?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. It's interesting. It's obviously there are different strategies, and I suppose that's what makes it interesting.
There definitely are, but actually, just linked to that, just picking up on what Matt said. He's talking about the talented or professional, especially talented or legendary, especially professional generals to influence your PBS cards and obviously scouting as well as part of this. I must admit, it's not something I personally pay much attention to. So am I missing a trick there?
Yeah, I think so, Nick. But it's a fairly small trick. I think the thing with the PBS and the terrain, it's a sub game all by itself, really. And you've only got so much thinking time kind of in a game. So I think, it's not very reliable. Whatever you try and do with PBS, my experience is it only comes off the way you want it about a quarter of the time. About a quarter of the time, you get something along the lines of what you want, and the other half of the time, it's just not helpful at all, really. So you may not want to invest too much of your thinking time on it. It may be better to concentrate on a few things. So, for example, PBS, the more the merrier, really. But there is an opportunity cost if you're buying really expensive generals and loads of skirmishers. Then your tugs are going to be less effective than they would be otherwise, because you spent all your points somewhere else. And to that extent, that will depend a little bit on playing style. I mean, I'm a bit of a skirmisher-aholic, really, so I always play with quite a lot of skirmishers. But even I, on occasion, have gone, yeah, actually, I don't really need. Why does this army need 5 or 4 or 3, whatever the PBS totals I've got? I'm playing with Spartans. Why am I scrabbling around for every little PBS I can get when I'm going to form up in a nice little box in the middle of the table and march towards the enemy is? It is worth considering what the end point of all the sub game is, because you can go down a rabbit hole and go, oh yes, against this horse archer army, I want to all out on forest in their backfield, and you overbuy your general, and your scouting and skirmishes to try and get your PBS to the total high, so you're not out scouted and you get the terrain where you want it, and then you haven't got the troops to get the job done.
Yeah, I have a principle that I want to have enough cards to control the army, but I don't worry about quality of general for PBS or scouting. I as long as the army's got enough cards, I don't really care too much what the PBS and scouting card numbers are. But to me, the choice of generals is much more important for being able to control the army effectively.
Yeah, so, I think that's more or less how I with armies. I tend to have I'll need 11, 12, whatever the number is. And it's only after I'm sure I've got that, I might start playing around to see if I can squeeze, an extra sug in that might just take me over. If you're doing your army on the spreadsheet and you see you're at 2.9 in your scouting, can I fit a sug in that'll just tip me to 3 for the scouting? But I think there's dangers there of essentially breaking the army to some degree.
I've done that before, and I've included that. I've split one of my skirmishing units up, so I get 2 units of poor javelin rather than say a unit of archers. End up with 13 UGs rather than 12. Gleefully get the extra PBS, and then have to deploy an extra unit in each tranche on deployment, and go, that wasn't such a good idea, really.
Now, you see, yet again, there's a bit I just ignore to a great deal, and I think I've noticed it a couple of times in these podcasts where I think Matt especially he's describing an army, one of the army podcasts we do, he's describing an army and he'll say, he's got ex-professional generals, PBS of this, scouting of this, and it's got a total of 12 UGs, so that's 3 in each quarter. And I just really
I think you mean
never
four in each third.
Oh yes, sorry. Yes. Okay, yes. I'm trying to rule myself out of ever umpiring ever again. You see, at the moment, I'm a bit tired of umpiring. Yeah, no, yeah, the thirds, and I think I've seen Stephen Stead comment on that as well, about trying to get if you like, an efficient number. And part of my thinking there is that because of the way scouting works, deploying by thirds is something, so especially with the first tranche that goes down, is almost the exception rather than the rule.
That's why 12 is the sweet spot.
Oh, do explain.
Well, 12's an even number, so and there's 10, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%. You're not paying out the extra tug or UG that you have to put down. And if it's thirds you're with, it's the same principle. Yes, I'm a bit retentive about it. I do try to keep my numbers fairly precise.
So is your perfect army, Matt, either 11 tugs and 1 sug, or 9 tugs and 3 sugs?
Yeah. 7 and 12. 7
Either
and 12,
12,
7 and 5. Sorry.
Either of those work. I actually quite like 15 as well. It's not as good, but that's usually because I have usually 5 or 6 skirmishing units, and there's a tug of 9.
Yeah. All of which, of course, has nothing to do with terrain at all.
Well, it's a unified whole, because if I get more terrain, I've got 6 units of skirmishers that I have to do something with. That's why I need a talented professional. But anyway, yes, we're kind of going off the point.
Okay. So, shall I drag it?
Oh, sorry.
I'll drag it back to PBS strategies.
Oh, Richard's riding to the rescue.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's probably worth just briefly mentioning territory types, because the significant ones obviously would tend to be plains, because generally with plains you're going to get more open terrain, so it's going to suit the skirmishing cavalry armies more, that sort of thing. Obviously, if you've got one of those rare armies that has camels or in large numbers, then desert is the terrain type that is beneficial. Then other than that, it then comes down to specific terrain items. For example, vineyards, I think, are only available in standard and coastal. The reason I mention vineyards is because they are, for some reason, a shooter's friend. Don't get me on to the logic, because I don't believe there is any, but vineyards allow you cover, but you can shoot out without any ill effects. which is obviously significant.
Can I just point out that I think it was Mr. Stovell who started the trend to using vineyards. He certainly put me onto them.
Well, yes, just a matter of reading what terrain's available, really, isn't it? It's
Oh, you see, that's a dirty underhand trick, is reading the terrain sheet.
That's almost as bad as reading the rules.
Oh,
I
no, that'll
don't
never
know.
catch up.
No, not going that far.
I would add that if you're looking for types of terrain that suits particular troop types, then vineyards are also elephants' friends.
Yeah.
Vineyards and
He
orchards.
beat me to
it. Vineyards and orchards, both found standard coastal, both standard and coastal, and forests, funnily enough, are Dev Charge's nightmare, which I've only recently discovered.
I love that rule.
Yeah, perhaps we can come on to that one later.
Yeah.
I think that is a specific one worth repeating. Actually,
Yeah.
sorry, I think after Richard wrote to the rescue, I've now diverted us away from Richard's pearls of wisdom, just to blame Paul for the prevalence of vineyards, of course.
Yeah. So there's vineyards. There's brush waddies and sandy ground for camels. For elephants, as Paul mentioned, there's rough and difficult terrain, both of which can favour elephants. Vineyards is an example, but elephants can do quite well in difficult terrain as well, which I think is often not spotted. I don't often see people deploying their elephants in difficult terrain. But anyway, there's thought there. And yes, I mean, if we're back to shooting, then obviously hills have an advantage for shooters in that they can sit on them and project their fire off the hill, and obviously then become more difficult to dislodge going up the hill. Figuring out the territory type that gives you the types of terrain that you want to take advantage of. I have to say, throughout all of this, however, I'm one of those people who would generally try to take a balanced army, which has a reasonable capability of fighting in terrain, but also can fight happily in the open. I'm not a fan of sort of one-dimensional armies for MeG competitions. That is partly because of the scoring system and the fact that you can end up with the dreaded sort of non-battle if you're a either a night army or a shooty army and you get a sort of wall of forested hills or something across the centre of your table. That can make it very difficult.
It is, yeah. Perhaps that's one. Hold that thought, because I think there's an important point there, Richard, and I think maybe move on to that. Can I just chuck in I'll try and get a rules bit right here. Just picking up on the Nellies, the elephant bit. You know, the elephants. You know, a number of difficult terrain they treat as rough, and one of the reasons that's so good for them is that whilst they're slowed in rough terrain, elephants are not affected or badly affected by rough terrain. So, you know, so they're moving in what a lot of troops will treat as difficult terrain, but at the mere cost of one base width, they're fighting as if it's in open terrain, which is pretty powerful.
Yes, against loose order foot, they'll get, whereas they're normally in the open, they really don't do very well against loose order foot as a rule. In an orchard or a vineyard, they're 2 factors better, which is significant.
Because the loose foot are affected by difficult terrain.
Yeah.
whereas the elephants are treating it as rough and are not affected. And I think a lot of people miss that.
Indeed.
There was silence after I said that. Oh, I felt I'd said something profound.
So what
rather
you're
than
saying is I
what-
shouldn't fight elephants with my cavalry in woods.
I think that would be a really bad idea, Mag.
Just
I
have to
mean,
drop that in.
yeah,
Unless you are really good at rolling black dice and your opponent is very good at getting S's with wounds, with red dice rather.
I think that would be good. Yes, definitely. Yeah, actually, although after saying what the effect is, I know I've forgotten it from time to time and put loose formation in difficult terrain, thinking, oh well, I've remembered the elephant bit, but I've forgotten that the loose foot are actually affected. Showing just how you can trick yourself. Anyway, Richard.
Yeah. So I think I've covered all I wanted to say on PBS strategies, unless anybody else has any thoughts about them and things I might have missed.
I've got a couple of minor points. One is when you're saying about picking the extra piece of terrain. So I've quite often seen folks sit there having the terrain where they thought they wanted it, kind of featureless or very dense, or whichever those two are particular ones. And they've got the option to move the thing as the last go because it's the last turn of the PBS. It is worth considering moving to either dense or open because you get the same number of terrain pieces as you would have got had you been. But it's not quite true. In the case of going from featureless to open, you get a piece that you wouldn't have got otherwise. But it's a compulsory piece, and it's your choice, and your opponent doesn't get one, so you're not really losing anything out there. And similarly, moving from very dense to dense, you get the choice of the odd piece, which could be can be significant.
See what you mean.
That's a fine bit of manoeuvring, but it is worth. The point being, maybe it's maybe worth spending 5 seconds pondering on whether you want to leave the token wherever it happens to be on the last turn if you've got a chance to move it, just because that's kind of where you thought because you wanted to very dense, so you've gone very dense, or you wanted lots of terrain, so you've gone very dense, or you wanted nothing, so you've gone featureless. Actually, when you've got the last chance to choose, it might be worth changing. Might be. And the other one I would make mention of is deep water as a secure flank. So I think it's really quite useful for armies that want to reduce the frontage but don't want to have to put up with terrain. Therefore, it's probably quite a good option for anyone who's new to playing the terrain game. And the width that you choose to deploy it can have interesting effects. You can have a minimum one doesn't really help it. That really just did give you a secure flank for protection against flank marches. But if you make it greater than 2 base widths wide, then people who habitually turn up with nothing but maximum size bits won't be able to fit them in if they choose them unthinkingly. If you make it slightly greater than 4 base widths, then no compulsory pieces will be able to fit. And I think the maximum is 6, isn't it? I think.
Yes.
So you can't stop minimum size optional bits being placed next to it, but they will be small bits. So yeah, deep waters can be pretty good, and the width of it has unexpected effects.
To add to that, if you take the minimum size waterway, deep water, so 1 millimeter on the table, it also means if they throw a piece of terrain that gets an odd number, so it has to go on an edge, it can only go on the back edges of the table. Because it can't.
Is that right? I thought that the
well, it's not a table edge.
I thought the edge of water, deep water, does count as a table edge for deploying terrain pieces.
I think
you can put terrain touching it, but I don't think I've ever seen it said that it counts as a table edge.
Oh, okay. Well, there's one for squabbling in the rules over, I guess.
It's almost certainly I'm wrong, but I've never seen it actually declared as a table edge. And the
We're
other
all
thing,
scrabbling for our PDFs now.
Yeah, and the other thing is you can also take deep water in the forms of lakes. Only as non-compulsories. You can't take them as compulsories, but if you take them as non-compulsories and only have them 4 wide and you have a maximum depth waterway, it can only land in either flank. So if it lands in the center, you don't get to keep it, but you can actually put it touching the waterway and push out the waterway effectively by another 4, so the full 10.
Oh yes, sorry. And one final rather definitely devious bit, which I'm going to blame the clerkers on for coming up with. There isn't anything that I can see that says that your waterway that you pick has to be continuously the same width in from the edge of the table.
Yeah.
And there are significant advantages in having it thicker on their side and thinner on your side, to put it.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can engineer. Yeah, I think.
And you could, and in an extreme example, you could engineer it with a sort of an inlet coming in to protect your baggage neatly.
Yeah. Just back to Matt's point. Since I've just pulled up the PDF, I've not had a big trawl through, but in the battlefield terrain section, the secure flank section, the compulsory terrain section, it says, what odd number must be placed touching a table edge. On an even number, it can touch the table edge but does not have to. And then the first place must be 2 base widths between pieces of terrain other than deep water. Terrain pieces may touch a deep water secure flank.
Oh.
So obviously, I think I would like to trawl through just to make sure I haven't missed anything. I've gone straight to one section, but I say one for all of us, including the listeners, is to check that one, because I've certainly played it as the deep water counts as a table edge for that terrain placement.
No, I think that's where I was getting confused. So I've just done a check. I can't find anything else. So I think that's the difference, that it still has to touch the table edge, but there's the 2 base width restriction between pieces doesn't apply to deep water.
Excellent. Well, there we are.
So,
there we are,
sounds
listeners.
Sounds like Matt's right.
See,
Can I have that in writing? I want that in writing in an email. Thank you. So rare. I want physical proof.
It is, so that's well worth putting out. So Matt is now climbing the sneaky terrain rules knowledge to try and challenge Mr. Stovell.
It's a very steep mountain. And the only other thing I had to add was there are certain troop types that you can only take as optional. I've already mentioned one, which was deep water, as in lakes or whatever you want to call them, but also the combining of terrain types. So having a hill with a vineyard on top of it, or a forest on top of a hill, whatever floats your boat. You can only do that with the optionals.
Yes. Yeah, a hill in the compulsory section is basically must have bare slopes.
Yeah.
It can be a mountain, which is MeG's term for a steep hill. Yeah. In other rule sets, I still tend to call them steep hills, I must admit, but it can't have covered slopes, and that is actually specifically laid out somewhere in the rules. One of those bits I can never find when people say, "Where does it say that?"
It's the grey bit at the bottom of the terrain section.
The bit I never read.
Yeah, that's the one.
Cool. Okay, actually just at this point, pick up on something Richard just said in there. But when he was saying he likes balanced armies, which can fight in terrain and in the open. So my takeaway from that is that Richard will usually have some troops that can fight, are capable of fighting effectively in terrain, be they presumably loose or flexible, or possibly flexible being the ideal because they can fight. They can be close formation in the open and loose formation in terrain if they need to be. Would everybody else sign up to that? Should your army design in general, a bit of a sweeping generalization, you'll always get exceptions, include a chunk of troops who are capable of fighting in terrain? And
I've never considered that in my list. I generally speaking, I think if there's a bit of terrain you don't like, you don't go near it. That's the solution. If the army has some loose order fighting troops that are in it, and they're good for other stuff, I'll pick them. But I won't pick a loose order unit deliberately for going in terrain. I'd rather have another SUG. Be my general principle.
Matt?
I agree with Paul. It's not something that really, as it happens, a lot of my armies are loose terrain capable, but they're not designed for that reason. But
as what I suppose I'm thinking of is, if you've got an army that's heavily close formation foot, say, would you have 2 or 3 flexible or loose formation troops? Would you deliberately pick them so that you can go, if there's a chunk of terrain somewhere on the table, I can have a punt in that terrain?
No, I'd have skirmishers.
It's got 2 for skirmishers. I am always reminded of something Sid said in one of the very early podcasts that was done, which was essentially on the line of don't just take a single unit, because they will tend to get, if the opponent has more combat, terrain capable troops, they'll just sweep one away. You're throwing away a tug if you do that. So it's almost, if you're going to do it properly, have at least 2 or 3.
There is one occasion where I've contemplated the odd unit of loose order. You can play a shell game with ambush cards in those circumstances. If you're fortunate enough to have a bit of terrain on each flank that you can ambush from, you can put an ambush in each one. And if your opponent's now your opponent needs to have 4 units guaranteed 2-to-1 in both the bits of terrain, and if he only puts 1 in one of them, and that's the one you've got the ambush in, you don't get swamped the same way. Anyway, it's just an idle thought. Rather too circumstantial to actually be planned for. But
actually, that sort of springs another question in my mind. Is sort of back to the army designing phase. If you design an army that's got a good chance of out scouting your opponent, do you design it with ambush? Do you think about ambushes at that stage as well when you're designing it?
My feeling is that ambushes aren't really worth doing, because it reduces because it means your last placement of toys is reduced, and that's your most crucial units for deployment generally. Having to do those earlier because you've got an ambush out there isn't great. I do see that there is a potential for deliberately picking an even number of tugs with the intention of ambushing with one of them, because in those circumstances the ambush may actually come as a surprise in the early rounds of the competition before news of your deviousness gets out.
It is, yeah.
Yes, I'm quite partial to the 10 tugs 2 skirmisher list.
Okay, I shall keep an eye on you, Matt. That's another point you're climbing the sneaky hill.
Yeah.
Could you...
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say the other reason I'm not a fan of ambushes is because you have to decide your ambush before you've seen much of your opponent normally. So
unless you've heavily outscouted,
you're sort of, so you're sort of committing yourself to a plan right up front. So I'm not a huge ambush user as a result.
Well, perhaps there's actually, because I know it was a comment that was sent in by Richard Basilowski. Once again, apologies to Richard if I've mangled his surname. who basically said, ambush is pretty pointless, in that anyone with a brain will have a good idea of whether an ambush is genuine or not. Do we generally subscribe to Richard's view there? And of both Richards, because Richard, RJC here.
Well, I think, although what I've said is I don't generally rate ambushes, there are a few exceptions where you might want to consider an ambush, possibly to actually seize a hill, because you can deploy further forward, or possibly I've also seen it used to seize a village or town. Again, to that effect. So although I think ambushes aren't great, they can on occasion have a use.
They can also be used to slightly befuddle whether you've got a flank march or not.
Yes,
you can put ambush cards down as well as the flank march card, and your opponent, particularly if your army is not one that obviously looks as if it's flank march capable, you may get some traction out of doing that. I've done that a few times. That's also one of those circumstances where you kind of need to think about it when you're designing your army list and your command structure, because it's less easy to do on the fly.
Yeah, I certainly, I very rarely think about ambushes. I must admit, I'm in the camp of, they're a bit, which I suppose it could mean if you get it right, it's more effective than it would be. But I do keep an eye open for whether I think an army I'm designing may want to flank march, and therefore, it's always nice in that circumstances to have a talented general to lead the flank march. So,
but it does beg the question, though, that all right, I'm not a fan of ambushes on the whole either, mostly because I'll guarantee you the general commanding it's going to get white cards for about the first 3 turns of the game, and it'll just sit there and do nothing. But that's my own personal hell. But it's also that they're totally free. It's the same with flank marches. Totally free, impacts nothing that you actually do in your deployment if they're fake. But none of us use them. Nobody puts down ambushes when they don't really intend to use them. Nobody puts down fake flank marches. It's just it's an odd facet of the rules that nobody really uses.
The fake flank march just annoys me.
Yeah,
because I don't use it more as a point of principle rather than anything else. I know we're not looking at rule changes, but I'd scrap fake flank marches, I'm afraid.
Making a note to annoy Richard by using fake flank marches.
Yeah,
there you go. I'll see 4 of them this weekend, won't I?
I dummy a double flank march every game. It's I'm with Richard on that one. I think in the very early initial release of MeG, there was a bit of a penalty if you dummied it. I think maybe the troops counted it out of command or something.
I think you lost the card, didn't you?
There was some sort of penalty, and I must admit, I'm with Richard that I don't like it and I don't do it. So if I do it against you, I must have a specific reason. Probably I'm a bit narked for some reason, or just want to be an arse.
I think it comes down to Paul's earlier comment that you've only got so much brain power that you want to be faffing around with, so you just cut out the extras.
Yeah, I'd also worry it might just slow the game up, or affect your opponent's deployment such that they hunker down a bit and makes it more difficult for you to get at them.
That's probably true. I think it's fairly reasonable to use a faint flank march if you've got an army that has got a sensible flank march that you have used, particularly if you've used it sometime earlier in the competition. To then dummy it seems to me quite reasonable. But yeah, I don't. And Graham Clark has said a little bit like Matt. There really is no reason why you shouldn't put a dummy flank march and 3 ambush cards down whenever you can, because it
Yeah.
costs you nothing. Other than, as Matt said, it does cost you some of your thinking time. And if you're doing that, maybe you're not contemplating how you're going to use your troops to their best to defeat your opponent.
Yeah, I mean that you sort of start focusing on what you've convinced yourself is a clever trick, and actually it's a distraction, and just getting your basic troops in the right place at the right time is actually one of your core skills, isn't it?
Yeah, and getting a result. I mean, if the time delay results in you getting a draw rather than a 15 point triumph, then it's not going to be worthwhile. I mean, this actually links onto one of my other objections, is when people place a wall of difficult terrain and just sit behind it, with no intent of scoring other than 2 points.
I suppose leads us nicely on to the, what are the risks of getting a non-game? It's and is terrain a factor in that? Well, it must be, I would have thought.
But I think that answers one of Richard's questions, that where he not our Richard
Yeah.
Balowski, where he says that the game is overly emphasizing terrain on the flanks. I think that's true. I also don't think as a mechanic it's a bad mechanic for MeG to have, because it reduces the impact of that wall of terrain. So going into the game that you've got limited chances of terrain in the middle. So your list design is either going to cope with that, or you have a specific strategy of overwhelming decent cavalry in the open with 13 tugs of Aztecs, for example.
Just to pick a random example.
Yeah, random example of, not that I've been using Aztecs a lot recently, but that's the principle. So yes, it might not be fully realistic to what people's perception of an ancient battle is or isn't. However, in terms of giving you a complete game in 3 or 3.25 hours, I think it's perfectly viable. That's my outrageous opinion on that subject.
I think it is a rule writer's challenge, actually, how to handle the asymmetric battle between, I suppose, one end would be a hill tribal army like Highland Gallic or something, which is all loose foot, and a entirely cavalry army on the other hand, because if the loose foot come into the open, they get ridden down by the knights or whatever. And if the knights go into the difficult terrain,
who'd be crazy enough to do that?
Yes, I was going to say. Then they're probably going to struggle to beat a loose foot army. So
except in forests.
Well,
unless
your loose foot army's devastating charges. Yeah.
Okay, we've mentioned that one a couple of times now, so perhaps we just expand on it for the listener. In that, the reason this has got mentioned is, make sure I get this right, is that if you've got loose formation foot like Gallic tribesmen who are devastating chargers, to qualify for the devastating charger claims, you need to be in 2 ranks. In a forest, the terrain rules very clearly say you can only fight in 1 rank. Therefore, you don't get your claims for devastating charger. You can still get the effect, I believe. So if you roll a skull or an S, you can get a shatter. But your loose formation foot won't, for instance, get the +2 versus infantry if they're fighting in forests. Have I got that right, chaps?
Yeah,
indeed.
That is indeed. It says troops may only shoot or fight in 1 rank deep.
Fair to say that pole arms won't be able to get their +1 against foot when fighting in forests either in melee.
Indeed. Indeed. So it's
So going back to the knightly example, impact's a bit dodgy, but fully armored knights on horses in a forest will actually beat up Gallic tribesmen.
Yes, we come back to that bit where although they are badly affected, so the opponent gets +3, if the loose formation foot will also be affected because it's difficult terrain. So the knights get +2 on top of their, say, fully armored, superior melee expert.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually have a problem with that because you'll get an awful lot more loose foot than you will knights.
Pin them in place and ram another unit in their flank.
If the point system is anything to go by. So, I actually think, having said that's an asymmetric match, it can actually be at least some sort of opportunity for a game. But it is as we say, always a bit of a challenge. And I'm not sure I've got any magic bullet answer to that one, to be honest.
I mean, the asymmetric. Sorry, Paul.
Obviously, in the lead up to the podcast, I've done a bit of pondering on where terrain might go. I wonder whether actually you just need to point loose order foot as if they're always in the open. If as the terrain system kind of does, you're not going to get useful terrain in the centre very often, then and one might argue they're already pointed that way because they are, a bit cheaper. I would argue that flexible, particularly barbarian flexible, probably costed a bit high. But yeah, let's say from a rules writer's point of view, perhaps if you work on the principle that all battles are in the open, anything else is a bit of an aberration, because people can generally avoid fighting in terrain if they don't want to.
It is, yeah. I think certainly in the sort of the non-battle scenario, that tends to come from something like a wholly loose army sitting in the rough and that. But you are choosing your army, but so you as you just said, you got to plan for the fact that there are likely to be big chunks of open space on the battlefield. So you want the composition, and if you can take bits that will help you in the open, I think you need to think about those. But I think there is an argument, I think, to a sort of inbuilt bias against those sort of armies, because they also tend to be ones that don't have great PBS, certainly not scouting. So their ability to sort of get advantages in that PBS stage are more limited. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's probably true, isn't it?
It is true to some extent.
You're almost forcing them to have a legendary general to try and get that, the first dice roll, as you were saying, Richard, and then defending at least, but and bumping their PBS cards so they've got more chance of shifting the marker or keeping it where they want it. Yeah, I will say just as an aside, I think some people are too nervous about loose formation foot in the open, and in some cases you can use the numbers against your opponent.
The only disadvantage in open against foot is the ability to be shoved.
Yeah. It's mounted is the big threat,
and the mounted thing is only a +1 at charge combat. There's no other difference. So it's perhaps not as drastic as people tend to react to it. Yeah,
I think they probably think of the sort of knights against loose, because the knights come out with quite a high factor and can get shatters, and that can roll down and do horrific damage. But against a lot of other armies, it's if it's just like a short spear cavalryman, it's not that terrible.
I mean, and a lot of the loose order foot, the popular loose order foot tends to be crossbowmen. Let's be fair about this, or powerbow, where they have a
powerbow cross. I'd say powerbow crossbow, or have melee expert.
Yeah.
But I think there is a bit of an argument I would support that there is an inherent, if you like, there's an inherent bias against certain styles of armies who.
Yeah, is it also the fact that if you a lot of people would take, say, loose foot bow, but then make them unprotected and combat shy.
Oh,
In which case they're gonna struggle in the open anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's what I think it's one thing I've noticed over the past, say, year, and I think this is something that's come from this podcast, and Richard especially, Richard Jeffrey Cook here is I see far fewer crossbowmen downgrade it to combat shy now. People are taking them as the non-combat shy because they want them to be able to stand a bit better. You fully utilize that wound on an S and not explode really quickly after that. And that's crossbowmen. Let's throw something else in on this whole loose, especially loose formation foot in the open sort of thing. I also wonder if people make a mistake when they're choosing their terrain. They might get something like a dense terrain, and then they go and so they'll want to choose the maximum number of terrain pieces for their loose formation army. And then they go and max out on maximum sized pieces. And that into my mind just means that there's more chance of them not fitting. So you want to take oval shaped pieces, so you've got more chance of squeezing them in and covering more of the table than the big round ones. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah,
well, I think that's excellent advice. I must confess I've never really been much for the square bits terrain, just because I think they look ugly.
Yes.
I do think there is a slight problem with the way the rules represent terrain, in that you've got to have all your front edge in. So to take an extreme example, if you had a crimped edge to your terrain, essentially you're just losing those few millimeters from the edge, because you can't ever put your troops in that bit without them actually counting as being outside. But there's always an issue with how you count as in or out, because the extreme the other way is you've got one corner of your base in the wood, therefore you count as in the wood. Just makes all your terrain items much bigger. But I'm not a fan of square bits of terrain.
I'll put the counter argument, which is I think square bits of terrain help avoid any doubt. I'll fully agree that they don't necessarily look right, but I don't regard certainly competition game. I have to say I actually have two sets of terrain. I have terrain for friendly games, which is round, and I have terrain for competition, which is square. Because I don't regard competition gaming as a spectator sport.
I don't regard wargaming as a spectator sport, but the aesthetics are a factor of it, and so, I think we can come to aesthetics in a bit. On top of what you're saying now, Richard.
I thought it leads nicely on to the whole issue of aesthetics in
let's go with that
terrain. So shall we go with that?
We can pick up any other bits that we think we've missed on that terrain bit.
A good example of the challenges is hills with slopes that troops can't actually stand on without shifting, again, for the terrain I take to competitions is all the sort of terrain map type terrain, so it's relatively flat pieces, and I will make up a gentle hill probably of two, so it's the basic terrain piece and a smaller piece sitting on top to indicate it's a hill, but the troops can still move over that without sliding. I take a few portable trees that go onto a forest rather than having a forest piece with trees built in, because then the troops can't sit on the trunks or whatever. And similarly with if I take buildings, they would be buildings that get placed on top of a suitably coloured built up area piece rather than having terrain that you can't move, so the building gets in the way of where the troops actually sit and that sort of thing. So yeah, and again, I take terrain for portability, so it's a compromise. The pieces I have are better looking than just plain bits of felt, which I do feel looks ugly. So that probably annoys me as much as square pieces annoys Paul. But yeah, for competitions, I take terrain, which is I've deliberately chosen to try and minimize problems in the game, but actually still give a representation of the terrain. But I mean, ancient battles, of course, very rarely had significant amounts of terrain that get mentioned in the sources anyway. Because so, and the other aspect of hills that actually are shaped and molded is that if you take it on a scale basis, they're actually the height of Everest or something, because the vertical scale obviously gets disproportionately increased by the models as well. So anyway, those are my thoughts about terrain aesthetics. I think it was Stephen, wasn't it, who asked those sort of questions.
A couple of people did ask.
Oh, and
about
Carl.
that. Yeah, and I think I think Richard Bezalowski also mentioned that his view was hills should be contoured. I think he's thinking, possibly thinking of at least done like a step pyramid. to
well,
show...
if they're contoured, put a piece of terrain, a mat or something under the contoured piece, so that if moving troops becomes really critical, you can take the contoured piece off and allow the game to play, would be my view.
I must admit, personally, hills that are a lump on the table do somewhat irritate me, and I have to say I've generally found that I've got hills where the troops slide around on. I've generally found it, you playing MeG, the community we've got, you just sort of agree where they are, and that it's not perfect, and there are occasions where you might have forgotten to agree, or you've remembered it in slightly different ways or whatever. But I've found on the slippy slidey hills, people are generally pretty good.
I agree. I'm probably overreacting.
I see exactly where you're coming from, because you're sort of removing the need to have that. So, and it does take time away from the game, as you just agree, and an inevitable bit of time as you try and balance the bases on the hill, and you think you've got it, and then you knock the table and your bases slide all over the place again. And so there isn't a perfect answer.
I think, to my mind, I think as usual, Richard was talking uncommon good sense about the terrain.
Yeah, it's the answer. Just take armies that don't want hills. Well, actually, another thing you're saying about the height, Richard. Well, you think about a lot of our terrain pieces are just too small. How big is a hill on a battlefield? You look at the Battle of Cainus-Scephalae. The hill is the battlefield. To represent it, you could tip your table. So one long edge is higher than the other long edge.
I've played on a few tables like that, but I don't think it's deliberate.
Almost every table I play on has something like that in the middle, where two tables join.
That's my biggest complaint. Why do the two tables have to join in the middle, which is where we do most of our fighting?
It's desperately true. Actually, just on that terrain piece size, and it does sort of link back to the terrain choice thing. I mean, this might be a diversion, but I'm going to say it anyway. Is that, in my view, we have to remember that for these competition style games, that our terrain generation system is essentially there to give us something hopefully interesting to fight across, and not necessarily represent anything that is actually even plausible historically. You know, they're good to take Caenoscephalii. We cannot generate a table that has the hill of Caenoscephalii with our terrain system. Our hills are grassy knolls, albeit the height of Everest. So yeah, I think we have to bear that in mind somewhat with our terrain system when we're thinking about it. You know, and that's almost what you need to measure it against.
I think that begs the question: should competitions perhaps have preset terrain?
Was there not a competition where you had variable armies that was run fairly recently? I didn't go to it, but how did
that was up in Preston. Unfortunately, it turned out there were only half a dozen people there. We never got the full effect of it. But yes, it was run on you took two army. Your army was the same army for both, and you took a 10,000 point and an 8,500 point version. And in the 4 games over the weekend, you would use your 10k one twice and your 8.5k one twice, and you just chose which battle you deployed them at. You know, at the start of the game, both sides had you got tokens for them, and you would to declare your tokens simultaneously. So, you know, I go 8.5, my opponent might go 10, or might go 8.5, and then you fought the game.
Okay, so it was just a standard game, other than the size of the army.
Yeah.
I was thinking that you could have an asymmetric setup of terrains, but have one side essentially a smaller points value than the other, and that side got the advantage of the asymmetric terrain. And I think you'd probably you'd probably need to have a special competition rule. That, for example, the smaller army started on 15 points and lost points for exits lost, rather than, or started on 10 and lost points and got an extra 5 if the enemy army broke, whereas rather than the normal faction. So it was positively encouraged for it to sit there and wait to be attacked.
Yeah.
The opponent would have the resources to do it, let's say. Because if you look at, you know, Hastings or Marathon at the start of it, or Karakefli, they're one side's uphill the whole game, really.
Yeah.
Or if you look at many, I mean, fair number of river crossings or stream crossings at least, where there's a stream across the middle of the table. Now, admittedly, giving Alexander more points than the Persians at ISIS would seem to strike against the reality of the situation. But in game terms, to make a game of it, that would be the way you want to represent it, would it not?
Yeah.
Yeah, river crossings are an interesting one, because actually most rivers weren't particularly defendable. The technique that seems to be used at river crossings was to let the armies to start crossing the river and then attack them before they could get themselves fully sorted out on the other side. And that's quite hard to represent again, but in perhaps a scenario situation, it's something that could be possible.
Yeah.
Something like having sort of 2/3 of your army deployed and then having the rest come on in dribs and drabs.
I think there's some you can definitely do some very interesting scenarios on that. I suspect you could do a competition with things like that, but I was saying, but you know, you'd have to have a good think about it. I suppose the advantage of the if you like the standard competition setup is it's easy. You just tell people to turn up, roll the dice, get the terrain down, and get on with it.
Yep.
Whereas you would have to. It involved more planning by the organisers to do it, and maybe providing the terrain depending on what you're doing as well. So but I think you could definitely get some input. And actually, just picking up on what Richard said, I certainly read recently about it. Was I forgot the name of the battle? It's Alexander's first battle in Asia.
Granicus.
Granicus,
yeah.
where traditionally it's a lot of history books and talk about the Persian cavalry defended the riverbank. But I've certainly recently seen a suggestion, it might have been in a Slingshot or similar article, which said actually the Persian cavalry were probably a bit back from the bank, because actually a riverbank is a lousy place to defend if you're on a horse. And they probably wanted a bit of room, especially because they're throwing javelins and running backwards and forwards. So, I think that supports what Richard was just saying. I think that's, not sure where we've ended up now. After that, but I think it's a sort of, I think there are, if you're doing like a one-off scenario game, if you were doing Granicus or a similar battle, or as Paul just said, a non-standard competition, there's no reason why you can't do things like that. Which sort of vaguely leads me on to a question Drew Moore asked, which should there be incentives for terrain objectives? I've always been a bit iffy about that for ancient warfare. It's not really that much of a thing, not in the big set piece battles, and I might be generalizing.
Yeah, no, that would be my view. I don't think terrain by and large was an objective in ancient battles. The main thing with an ancient battle was actually to be seen and to defeat your opponent. The idea that people were looking for sneaky tricks, I think can be overrated. I mean, the Chinese actually are perhaps a more notable exception than many other cultures, in that Chinese warfare often placed a great emphasis on obtaining tactical advantages. And that may be in part due to the sheer size of Chinese armies, which generally could be substantially larger than perhaps armies in other empires or areas, just because of the density of cities and the supply of food that was available in the central China plains.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that, I think like most big battle, ancient medieval sets of rules, MeG is quite heavily driven by the Western traditions. Partly because actually the detail, as I'm sure you know, because you've been going through all these battles, extracting information of the sort we want from Chinese sources especially is really quite difficult, because their historiographical traditions are completely different.
Yes, yes, having just gone through all the Asian battles, I would wholeheartedly agree with that.
Sorry, Matt, I'm not sure we allowed you your comments on terrain representation and the hill question. So I don't know whether you want to add anything to what we've said.
I have to admit, I'm utterly agnostic. As long as I'm enjoying the game and my opponent's enjoying the game, I really don't care what the terrain looks like, quite frankly. It can be contoured hills, steep hills, whatever. I mean, yeah, there's practical considerations around those things. But to be honest, it's more about failing to roll dice and getting bad command cards. The look of the terrain's sort of a distant third on that one. But, so, yeah.
I do. I'm with Richard. I don't like just bits of felt. I'm not what I know. I thoroughly appreciate the comment on practicality for square terrain, but I prefer at least rounded edges.
I use rounded edges for that very reason, because I have one square terrain piece which I use for compulsory flanks, for a secure flank. But other than that, everything else of mine is contoured.
Yeah,
simply because I'm not a geometrist.
Yeah, it is. But there, and actually, just to pick up a point Richard made, that portability. I basically will always drive to a competition in this country. So I put my army bag in, and I've got another bag that's got terrain in it, so I can actually take a reasonable amount and make it carryable. But I know some people that's less of a thing. So you have flatter, lighter terrain. It becomes quite a thing in that case. I mean, I still go a bit on that, but I do know where people are coming from, and
I mean, I would love the Flames of War style tables for MeG, but that goes back to Richard's comment that it needs pre-planned terrain basically to be viable, and then you've got the dynamics of how you do the draw, who ends up on what table, do you balance it? So there's
also
a
one of
lot.
the big. Sorry, Matt, I was talking.
No, I was just saying there's a lot of complexity around that style of terrain use.
It is, and I've thoroughly admired a lot of Flames of War terrain, but a lot of the ones that stick in my mind are basically urban settings. I think at BritCon one year, we basically had a whole strake of tables that was basically Stalingrad, if I remember rightly, or the battles were sort of Stalingrad type battles. That just, as Richard said, that just isn't the sort of thing that's described for these big battles that MeG is representing.
Yeah, 20th century warfare is about the first time where actually being concealed is important. In pretty much pre-20th century, it was all about actually being seen most of the time. So yes, it is a very different sort of setup, basically.
Yeah. So I think to get the similar sort of that wonderful quality, you'd be spending a lot of time modeling grass.
Yeah, very true.
and I've seen some wonderful tables doing that. I'm not saying you can't do it. There's almost a bit of apart from maybe more one-off scenarios, you do a big demo game sort of thing. I suspect for most people, the cost benefit of doing that for the sort of games we play, and especially if you're doing the 4 games in a weekend where you're playing against a different army each time. Or am I just making excuses for it?
I think it's a bit different. If you remember the Battle Day, Nick and I were both at the Society of Ancients Battle Day, where we were refighting Scipio's battle in Spain that I'm struggling to remember the name of. Illipa, that's the one. And the people there had gone to some great lengths to produce some really super looking battlefield terrain, but you can do that as a specific one-off event. It's not nearly as practical for the competition circuit.
Actually, just randomly picking up on a point, well, both of you made, urban areas. I think the one thing we haven't touched on the terrain is there are some interesting options around towns and villages and what their edges are counted as. Barricades or obstacles. The same with enclosed fields, which you can have if you manage to get a town down. So there are some interesting options, but which many people don't even try. I don't think I've seen anybody use them. Lee Saunders might have done, actually, thinking about it, but
I had it used against me by a player. Oh, can't remember which competition now. They placed I think it was a town, and tried to place a boundary field. I think it didn't actually get on. I'm not. I have to say, this again is probably because I'm not a huge fan of the idea of built-up areas in battlefields anyway. It tends to be a rule I don't sort of try for them, because I don't pick armies that, again, they're on the defensive, and that's perhaps not my style of play as well. I'm not good at just sitting back and hoping the opponent's going to attack me.
I tend to agree, but it's quite interesting if you land it in the middle of a horse archer army's central section. They really can't defend it because they could get off. Well, can you get off to defend the barricade on a built-up area? I guess not. So
Don't
they
think
can't
so.
defend it. It basically just snarls them up.
Well, yeah, but then they'll probably go nowhere near it, and then you've got almost a non-battle.
Becomes a
Is the
piece of
danger.
impassable for them.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, it means
it's
they've
along
got
the
to
line.
pick. They've got to pick which side they deploy on, basically. If it's sat in the middle of their terrain, in the middle of their central sector. Yes, it cuts it in half, but whether it makes it a non-game, I don't know.
Might slow the game down.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah. Sorry, Paul, have you ever, have you ever used boundaried fields or towns or villages? Because
I did a bit. I had them as an optional piece on a hill. You might imagine. And I did get steamrolled, I think, by Ian Newell's Zulus. Sorry, Bantu. In a game, he came straight over the barricades. It wasn't there. Very disappointing. I was trying to defend it with unprotected artist, I think. So my bad. I think they neatly fall into the category of asymmetric hills, asymmetric terrain like hills and vineyards and so forth. They do have the tendency to produce a non-game, and from that point of view, you need to use them sparingly. But I do quite like the idea of picking one against a horse archer army, because you probably get to pick it in circumstances where you won't get to pick a forest. And if it does go down on the horse archers' baseline, then they can't evade over a barricade at all, can they?
Well, that's interesting. I think they
I can't
probably
remember what
can
the
go
movement
through.
rules are.
Well, because it's only classed as a barricade if you defend it. So I'm guessing if you
okay.
flee through it or evade through it, you can go through it.
But
the other thing about using it against the horse archer, of course, is they're trying to get no terrain on the table. And if you're wanting to put boundaried fields, and you've got a stronger chance of all of that lot landing on the table. But anyway.
You only get the boundary. Where are we?
It's an option, isn't it? You have to have the town placed first, don't you?
It's maximum of one per pre-laid town or village.
Oh no, you can have it with a village if you're post 800 CE with your list, presumably your list, or is it your opponent's list? If
it's the defender. It counts as the defender's terrain.
But the defender's time as well as the defender's date. Interesting.
That would be the logical
I bet
thing.
nobody's ever specifically chosen an army at 799 or 801.
to be honest,
they will now.
As a serial horse archer user, a village, it's a piece of difficult going, and that enough is the thing. If it was, say, a marsh or a forest, it's more or less the same effect. If it lands in my half of the table, it's something that's getting in the way of my movement. It doesn't matter if it's a village. It's difficult terrain, and that's the bit that counts. If it's in my opponent and they could be defending it, in some ways that might just actually be telling me where some of their troops are going to be.
I think you're protesting too much.
I've said a number of times, actually, when I use horse archer armies, I don't spend that much time thinking about the terrain or stressing too much if it lands in say dense or very dense, because a lot of the time you still got plenty of room to maneuver around. And I with horse archer armies, I've generally always wanted to out-scout the opponent. And the terrain can be a bit, whatever. And certainly if it's rough going terrain and you've got flexible horse archers, you put them in skirmisher and they move reasonably rapidly through that. Although you tend to lose one file in 3 on the shooting frontage. But, I'm not saying I completely ignore it, but I'm a bit, whatever.
I would argue there are several.
Sorry, go on, Paul.
Sorry, I was going to say that I'd argue there are several armies for which horse archer armies go, rough going. Thank you very much.
it can help you against big charging knight army,
or long spear and pikey armies.
Yeah, anything where it takes their claims away.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly if I I remember quite early on in MeG competitions, using a horse archer army against something like the Serbian Empire, and so I will throw as many patches of rough going down as I can to sort of channel where the knights are going to go. And even if they decide to run them through the rough going, they'll be going slower, and hopefully I will get more shots at them.
Excuse me, gentlemen, I've got someone at the door.
Okay, no problem. So it's yeah, just that's but other armies I'm a bit more. I think a lot of the time with some armies, a lot of people focus on getting a secure flank.
I have to admit, I focus on terrain for my army's purposes rather than using it against a horse archer army. Because I mean, I mentioned it before, my Ottomans actually love rough going because of all their skirmishing light horse. Plus the fact they've got the Janissaries as well. So as an army, although there's a lot of cavalry, Serbian knights and that kind of thing, it actually likes quite a busy rough table.
Yeah,
because it surprises a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that the point is made. The skirmishing horse or skirmishing foot through a piece of rough going, especially, can get some people. They might go, "Oh, I'm fighting a very mobile cavalry army or whatever it is. Oh, excellent! There's a piece of rough going or a steep hill that's anchoring one of my flanks," and then you swarm over it with infantry archers or like skirmishing archers, and suddenly they're being shot at by 6 files on the corner on something that they'd initially thought, "Oh, I'm quite safe from this quote horse archer army." So there we are. Actually, as we were just talking about, just to move the subject on again a bit about the sort of alternative competition styles. Perhaps it's a time to pick up on Simon Stokes's question about are there some terrain features it makes sense to include in campaigns? I think probably scenarios as well that you wouldn't use in a competition game.
Paul, I seem to have inadvertently muted you, so you'll have to unmute yourself at your end. I apologise.
I am unmuted.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nick. Carry on.
Yeah. So it's about your terrain that I suppose it's terrain that might be used differently in a campaign game or a scenario game. And Richard's already mentioned. I think he's done some with maybe involve rivers or something. I can't remember. Sorry, Richard, I've forgotten what you said.
Well, I'm not sure I did say it, but certainly in the Pacto campaign event earlier this year, one of the battles was actually a river crossing scenario. And in fact, basically I thought the river crossing was actually too difficult to attempt, given the armies and the terrain, and I actually flank marched a substantial chunk of the army, hoping the flank march wouldn't arrive. Ironically, it did. Trust my luck, needing 2 red cards, I actually got 2 red cards, and then promptly proceeded to lose the battle. Yeah, it's getting the balance right between defending. I think Simon himself mentioned mountain passes, where I would argue you should be allowed secure flanks on both sides, which is there. But yeah, I mean, campaigns do offer the opportunity. First of all, you could have the territory type determined by the hex or the area in which the battle occurs, so that can introduce interest, although it's outside the scope. Really, you could have the opportunity for weather as well, of course, with campaigns, which can add another variety to the battles. But Yeah, I'm not sure I've got any other particularly brilliant ideas about utilizing terrain.
Yeah, I think well, obviously, if you're designing a scenario, you state the obvious. You're certainly not limited by things like the terrain sizes that come in the rules generation system, and you can always do whatever whatever you like, or whatever if you're recreating a particular battle, something specific for that. But I think your mountain passes one is interesting. If you're doing one where a battle is taking place in a hex, say, which represents a chunk of terrain, you might still want to use something similar to the terrain generation system, but as you said, with differences. You could say there must be at least one secure flank, possibly two. Everybody must pick at least one steep hill, mountain.
Well, one of the bugbears I've got is that compulsory terrain doesn't have to reflect the territory type. So I think compulsory terrain in a forest territory type should include at least one forest.
Oh, right.
Similarly, in mountain, you can end up with mountain territory type where you've got a table that's as flat as a billiard table, which just doesn't seem right to me.
Sorry, just to leap in on this one.
Yeah, no,
as
please.
a simple idea for a competition theme. Have a competition theme where your army must have mountains, or must have forest, or plains, or desert, whatever you choose. But
yeah,
and then if it were mountains, then you could say that there is always a compulsory secure flank, and both players must put a mountain down. It's a forest. Same with forests. And that might that would be quite a fun way of slightly having a terrain influenced competition, which wouldn't actually require much work from a competition organisers, and would just be a fun way of sorting which armies people could play with. I haven't actually looked at all the armies that have any of those to see whether it works, or whether you end up with a very odd selection of armies, but I put it out there.
Yeah, no, it's
I think it's Almani, isn't it? One of the Germans that's only forest, and they're flexible tribal, and quite nasty flexible tribal at that, if I remember rightly.
You could be right. Yeah, there are some occasional oddities.
That brings me to another question: should army lists be limited to 3 territory types?
Oh.
I mean, why shouldn't we have an army list which says any except desert or something like that?
The alternative approach might be, yes, the army list says that, but when you choose your army, you have to pick a home territory type, so you only turn up with one.
Oh, so it's fixed for all. Yeah. That's an interesting idea.
So even if you got like these standard mountains, plains, or whatever they are, whatever your 3 are, you've got to go, well, okay, mine's actually going to be mountains.
Your operational area for the week, or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that's interesting.
I think you could play around with that. I'm very sympathetic to the idea. If the battle's taking place in forest, you should have some. The mountains one, actually, I suggest might be a bad example. Having been to Switzerland recently, the mounted valleys are a couple of miles wide and flat.
Yeah, but there's a mountain on the flank.
Secure flank, which could be the table edge.
Well, yeah. So maybe
okay,
you only have to pick a mountain if there isn't a secure.
Yeah. Okay. No,
mountain
but
flank.
I'll be a bit cheeky with that one, because I think it's back to that. What I said earlier about the terrain generation system is to provide something interesting to fight over that's thematic. So if you're in mountains, yeah, okay, you should pick another hill. Yeah, along the way. I think that I don't mind that. I think that's quite a nice idea, actually. It keeps the thematic bit going. So on that, so I was just about to ask something else, and it's completely forgotten. So I don't know if anybody else has got anything they wish to throw in at this point.
I think there was a question asked about front ranks.
There was
fighting.
It was
from
Tommy's
Tommy.
question. It was, yes.
So yeah, quite specifically, the line of fighting, which is generally the front edge of the base that's doing the fighting, is what determines whether the file is in a specific type of terrain. So, and that's intentional, because remember, base depths are far greater than the actual they would be if they were actually people to scale. So a 8 deep hoplite phalanx occupies a depth of about 8 yards maximum, probably a little bit less. On the scale of the table, that would be about 4 or 5 millimeters. So that's why the front edge is used, and that's why the line of fighting is intentional the way it is.
But to expand on that, because actually I'm just realizing that maybe I'm not clear on the rule. So a pike phalanx whose front edge of its front base is outside of the wood counts all 4, even if the rest of them are in the wood.
Yeah,
fighting.
Yes, for fighting.
Okay.
Yeah. To be slightly more specific, Matt, if any part of the front edge of the base is out and that bit is contacted, then they're out. Hasn't got to be all the front edge.
Yeah, but if the entire front edge is contacted, then it's in the terrain. If any part of the front edge is contacted in the forest, it would be that pike phalanx would be treated as fighting in terrain. It's got to be entirely in the good going to count as being in the good going.
Yes, because if I catch a pike phalanx with one corner out of the wood, I am going to align and make sure I'm fighting it in the wood.
Yeah.
If you're loose, and if you were
cavalry
knight, say the other situation, knights in the open contacting a loose that has its corner stuck out, as long as the knight doesn't move into the wood, the knight is treated as in good going.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole section in the rules on effective
you could probably do about
diagrams.
20 diagrams to
yes.
clarify all of that, but
it is.
And
Yeah.
I would just like to say that for shooting, it's the reverse. For shooting, you have to have all of the front edge out to count as out.
Yeah.
Part of the front edge won't do. Whereas it potentially could do for melee.
Yeah, that might be a slightly inelegant piece of rule writing where the two situations are different. I'm sure you can argue it, but it might have been. It's one of those. There's probably an argument they should have been the same, just so that to avoid confusion.
I'm not sure. I couldn't. Well, anyway.
Yeah, but certainly if your front edge is out, because it sort of cropped up in a game at campaign between myself and GK, didn't it, Paul? I think you actually looked up the rules for us.
Yeah.
As on that front edge bit. So because I pushed some skirmishing infantry, so the front edge was outside of a wood because I believed I could shoot with all my ranks, and GK said, "Is that right? Because your back ranks are in the wood, so surely you only fight or shoot with one rank." And Paul and Graham Wilmot kindly checked the rules for us while we carried on doing other stuff, and it was exactly as Paul has said. That was quite important. Right, I sort of get the feeling we might be reaching the end here. I think is there, unless anybody's got anything that they wanted to bring to this that we haven't already covered. I don't know if Paul, we've got any sneaky tricks, or are you going to sit on the rest of them for us?
No, I shall leave you with one sneaky trick though. Relatively difficult to arrange, but cataphracts are quite popular these days, so it's probably it might be worth noting that cataphracts do, by and large, are dev charge. And dev charge and close lancers, which will be the late medieval type, do not enjoy fighting in rough terrain very much. And because they're dev charge or chargey lancers, they have to pursue the full distance even into terrain.
Yes.
So if you can arrange to fight with a unit you don't mind losing in front of said terrain, it is possible to lure them into said terrain, where even if you haven't got anything that can fight them, they may well spend quite a few turns escaping from it.
Oh yes, with their one base width move or something.
Yeah, that's it. One base width move, I think,
in difficult. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. Yes, have something that forces them to charge that you can afford to lose, and then watch them struggle for 3 moves to get out of the terrain.
Yeah. Against those superior cataphracts, you haven't really got anything in your army that you can actually deal with them frontally. It might be a thing.
Matt, anything else on terrain?
No, I think we've
I think we've
gone
covered quite a
around
lot.
the houses a fair round the built-up area a few times.
Village, town. Has it got a boundary wall? Is that why we've gone round it? Because the boundary wall has stopped us going into it.
Absolutely.
Richard, before I just dribble off.
Before we go, I'll throw a grenade in there. What is the point of rough terrain? I don't think. Let's get rid of it.
So just have 2 sorts of terrain:
Difficult.
good going and something else.
Yeah, that's all that ever appears in the ancient sources, as far as I can see.
Well, I would actually, I'd almost go a bit further than that in some respect. If my recent reading of battle accounts in preparation for this, so Watling Street, Boudicca's lads all come to take the Romans on. One would expect them to be quite good in terrain, but the Romans set themselves up deliberately between 2 woods, because that's and the Britons have no thought of infiltrating the woods. Agincourt's similar, although there are a few people that do sneak in the woods, but it's it's a raiding party. There's no sort of outflanking moves through the woods. So in some respects, any terrain in an ancient battlefield, it's quite often that nobody go. Either everyone can go there or nobody can go there. I think the possible exception, there might be a case for certain terrain that cavalry are less keen on than foot, but I don't think there's any supporting histories for that.
Well, interestingly, horses don't generally like charging downhill. And there probably is an argument that cavalry shouldn't get a bonus for being uphill.
Yeah,
but
I've read that.
it's one of those things.
Against them. Yeah.
So
actually,
certainly, I think before Caenis the 2 sides sort of encountered each other in some, I think it was sort of cultivated gardens or whatever, and the skirmishers skirmished against each other, but then both sides, by mutual agreement, actually moved away from the area. So there is something to what you're saying, Paul, in terms of difficult going, although it would make Teutoburger Wald rather difficult for the Germans if they hadn't been able to ambush the Romans in the forest.
Yeah, but they ambush out of the forest onto what presumably is more of a path area at Calcrease.
Well, I think the Romans are following the path, yes. Yes, so I mean that maybe there's a point there that yes, you've got a very narrow strip of good going stuck between a whole load of difficult forest. Yeah, I think the idea of woods that you can go through easily is a complete nonsense. They're just ordinary odd trees that happen to stick anywhere. Now, in the American Civil War rules I'm developing, actually it becomes more difficult to command troops that are in difficult terrain. So that would be an interesting
if you're in certain terrains, you're always out of command.
Well,
or like it needs a 1 colour more or something.
Something like that, indeed. Anyway, but these are not going to be anything that will see light of day in the MeG rules anytime soon.
Oh, no.
So please do not write in panicking that we're changing the rules.
Yeah, but I think it's probably fair to say that especially in the big battle sets, and I think probably in ancient medieval sets in general, terrain rules are just as they have been forever. and I'm not sure how much people think about them. You just write in your rules with your rough going, your difficult going, and rough effects.
I certainly believe the MeG terrain rules were a bit of an afterthought rather than during the development process. I believe a lot more time was spent on trying to get the basic rules right, rather than worrying about terrain.
Yeah, I suspect
but
that's
maybe
true of a lot
some
of
point in the future.
Yeah, I think that's probably true of lots of other ones. Looking at some of the other ancient war games rules, they're the same. They're the same as they ever have been. Just tweaked to whatever their particular, some particular bits about their rules. Anyway, I think perhaps we'll wrap it up at that point and just come to the sort of any other business, any announcements or words of wisdom people want to impart. Obviously, Richard's already mentioned that he's now up to a ridiculously high number of battles have been added to the army lists.
So I've updated the history notes for the Asian army lists, so that now we have some nearly 4,000 battles and campaigns listed in the MeG army lists. And for anybody who wants to skip those, use the PDF bookmark facility and you can go straight to the list of your choice without having to scroll through all the pages of the history notes.
It is making the PDFs longer. Think all this extra stuff you're getting for free, folks. you use the bookmarks. So
good job, Richard. Well done.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Matt and Paul, anything you think the listeners should know about in terms of things happening in the MeG world?
No, nothing that I know of.
Matt?
We've got your event this weekend coming up, depending on when this it may have happened, or it's Schrodinger's competition at the moment.
It is depending when Matt has time to do his editing stuff. It will be that. Yeah, it's the theme with no name, sort of a sort of latish medieval one. After that, sorry.
So I was going to ask.
Good luck at this point, as I'm not going. So good luck, and then shall I say congratulations and just list all the competitors, and you can edit the right one in later.
Genius move.
Genius.
Can I mention that I am planning to run a Pacto campaign, a one-day event at Colours this year, which is the early September. At Newbury Racecourse. Details on the MeG forum. The campaign itself will be based on the Society of Ancients board game, The Saxon Shore is Burning, which is a game about the barbarian conspiracy. Yeah. So it will be 4 barbarian players trying to pillage Roman Britain, and a 5th Roman player trying to stop.
There we are. Well, I'm certainly interested in that. Just in terms of other competitions, that are happening over, say, June, July. Obviously, the one we just referred to is on the 1st and 2nd of June. So maybe it's almost like it'll be tomorrow if this this podcast comes out quickly, or it was last weekend or the weekend before if it doesn't. 29th and 30th of June. In Ireland, the Irish competition, 6th and 7th of July. There's one up in Preston, Ribble Rumpus. The Irish competition is early medieval, later medieval, and American armies from 900 CE. The Ribble one is armies and enemies of the Greeks, Macedonians, and their successors. And then the 20th and 21st of July is attack in devisers, and it's armies with 8 chariots minimum. Actual full details are on the forum, of course, so I'd say please go and look there. That's just the heads up for those ones. And as ever, I am now just going to check whether I have missed out anything that is happening on the continent in June and July. And I don't think so is the answer. No, just checking, at least on what's on the forum. There doesn't appear to be anything. A nasty habit of forgetting our continental friends, and always have to apologise for that. So yeah, so there we are. That's the upcoming comps. And there's plenty of time to paint new armies for things. And then in August there is BritCon in Nottingham. Tickets are basically no limit. It's open competition, 5 games over 3 days. Everyone's welcome. And if we've got anything else to announce, we shall call that it and say thank you very much for listening. As ever, if you've got any ideas for things we can cover on this podcast, please let us know. We're always open to that. And hopefully we'll be recording another one sometime soon. But as ever, we don't, we have no schedule. We do them when we think we fancy it and we've got a subject. So again, thank you very much to Paul for coming along to this and providing his insights. I've definitely learned stuff from him. Squirrel away. I'm just worried about the bits he's kept back for himself.
Wow.
Matt, oh sorry, Paul.
No, I was just going to give an evil cackle, but
Matt, thank you in advance for the editing, and Richard, obviously, thank you for all the contribution and obviously for the list work. So thank you very much. See you all soon, hopefully.